That man figured out how to finesse the record industry, and people don't talk about that. Do you know how embarrassed the record industry was? Do you know how hard they've been whipping artists since then?
Guys, buckle up because I'm about to tell you the story of one of the biggest finesses in the history of the music business. This video is titled the $20 million finesse, but really it was even more than 20 million, and to this day, Finesser is still earning more and more money every single day from this incredible move that he pulled off. Now, the finesser in this story is Frank Ocean. If you guys don't know who Frank Ocean is, you should, because he's become one of the biggest R&B artists of all time, completely revolutionizing the sound of R&B as we now know it. Coming up in a time when artists like Chris Brown, Usher, and Trey Songz were dominating the R&B industry with more X-rated ballads and pop hits, Frank Ocean came in with a different approach, combining introspective lyrics with lush, experimental soundscapes, creating a unique fusion of R&B, soul, and pop that explores deeper issues of love, identity, and existential reflection. And his peers definitely viewed his innovative approach to R&B as a threat to their own careers, as we saw when Chris Brown encountered Frank Ocean in a parking lot at a studio. The two got into a fight which left Frank Ocean's fingers cut. Now, with Chris Brown's fights between Usher, Drake, Frank Ocean, and now recently Quavo, I think it's time I make a video on all the beefs that Chris Brown's had, so if you guys want that, just let me know in the comments. But otherwise, besides finessing all the other R&B acts out of that #1 spot, Frank Ocean also finessed his record label for over $20 million. So let me explain. In 2009, the world was introduced to Frank Ocean as he was part of the collective Odd Future Wolfgang Kill Them All. The group was also comprised of guys like Tyler, the Creator, and Earl Sweatshirt, and the group was known for their quirky style, their funny skits, their fashion, their freestyles, their mixtapes. They came with a very different aesthetic than most rap collectives at the time, and for that reason, Frank's unique talent caught the eye of the massive record label Def Jam, who ended up signing Frank Ocean in 2009 after he gained some buzz in Odd Future. And initially, this signing kind of started off a bit rocky, which is very common with newer acts and a massive major label. Those type of labels operate like a machine, right? They're investing in artists, and if they don't get a high return on that investment, then they won't invest as much into the artist in the future. And with Frank's style and sound going against the grain of what was very common in the R&B world at the time, it might have been hard for Def Jam to see the bigger picture of how worthy of an investment Frank Ocean was. So as a result, they didn't give him the proper support and investment that maybe he felt like he deserved. And because of that, obviously he was unhappy, but at the same time, he was still writing massive songs for artists like Beyonce, John Legend, Brandy, and even Justin Bieber. While Frank wasn't receiving the support that he needed from his label to be able to put out his first album, he took inspiration from his rap collective Odd Future and copied their framework where they were independently releasing their own mixtapes. And that's exactly what Frank Ocean did as he released his first independent mixtape, which really was an album, titled Nostalgia Ultra in 2011. Put it out completely free. If you guys remember the DatPiff days when you could just go on a website and download free mixtapes from your favorite artists, then you probably remember Nostalgia Ultra. It was a phenomenal project, and it's really what catapulted Frank Ocean to the mainstream and gained him the respect that he truly deserved. At this point, even without a major label debut album, he was still collaborating with guys like Kanye West and Jay-Z. And with the buzz that he garnered from Nostalgia Ultra and all the collaborations that he was doing with some of the biggest rappers in the game, Def Jam finally saw the potential in him, and that's when Frank Ocean demanded $1 million from the record label to complete his debut album. We now know that album as Channel Orange. Apparently, he wrote the album in only 3 weeks, and it costed him about $240,000 to create. He finally drops it in 2012, and it's an absolute smash hit, with songs like Thinking About You and Pyramids topping the charts. Even won a Grammy for the album, in the same category that Chris Brown was nominated in, and you could see videos of Chris Brown not being too happy about this, because while everyone was giving Frank a standing ovation as he went up to collect his award, Chris Brown was the only guy in the entire crowd at the Grammys just sitting down. Now, it's important to mention that when Frank Ocean initially signed his deal with Def Jam in 2009, the contract stated that Frank Ocean had to deliver Def Jam 2 albums in 7 years. So now Frank's already given Def Jam one of his 2 albums that he needs to give them, Channel Orange. And in 2013, Frank Ocean announces his next album. At this point, Frank Ocean is on top of the R&B world. Hype for his next album is bigger than ever. But we don't hear much about it until 2015, when he gives us more detail on his second album, stating that it'll actually be a double album, or that we'll be getting 2 versions of the album along with a magazine. Now, this is important to remember because while we still didn't get new Frank Ocean music for another roughly year, it was clear that Frank had a very strategic approach to how he was ready to release his second album, capitalize off the massive buzz that he currently had. So again, in 2015, he announces that his second album will feature 2 different versions, and we don't hear anything else from him until the 1st of August in 2016, when we get a random live stream that goes up on Frank Ocean's website. Now, this live stream was obviously teasing the album, and in the live stream, it's basically just Frank Ocean in a warehouse building something, and in the background, we see a bunch of instruments and the Apple Music logo. We knew that this was in reference to Frank Ocean's next album because at the time, Apple Music was building their platform up. People were still consuming music by actually purchasing digital copies of the albums and singles via iTunes or other platforms. And in an attempt to switch music listeners over to streaming platforms, Apple Music was collaborating with artists like Drake and Chance the Rapper to drop Apple Music exclusive albums, where basically these artists would drop their albums exclusively on Apple Music streaming platform, and if you wanted to listen to the album, you could only hear it on Apple Music. Many fans were speculating that because Frank had the Apple Music logo in that live stream, that basically his next album would be an Apple Music exclusive. And they were absolutely right, but there's a little twist to this story, and this is where it gets interesting. See, this live stream was very plain. It just, again, had a bunch of instruments in it, and we would later find out that these instruments would later end up forming into the instrumentals from his next album, which would be titled Endless. So the stream lasts around 140 hours, and it's just Frank building a staircase with a bunch of instruments in the background. As the stream came to an end, he started playing the actual songs from the Endless album, and eventually an Apple Music link popped up which led to the visual of the actual Endless album. If you clicked on the link, it would lead you to Apple Music, where you can watch the part of the live stream where Frank is playing the album. This confused many fans because he was hyping up this second album for years and years, and basically what we got was just some very bland stream, and the album was marketed as just this 45-minute visuals with a bunch of instrumentals. And at the same time, throughout these 7 years that Frank was signed to Def Jam, it was very public that he had to replace lawyers, his management team, and he also had to repay a $2 million advance to Def Jam that he got to record that second album. This was his first strategic move because by doing so, he was able to keep full ownership of the recordings of that second album. So now Frank has officially dropped his second album, Endless, on Apple Music, so he's officially out of his contract with Def Jam since it was only structured to be a 2-album deal. He also repaid his $2 million advance from the label, so at this point he owed them nothing. The fans and record labels alike were extremely confused because after this whole wait and all this trouble and back and forth that he had with his label, it was weird that all we got was this instrumental album that came in the form of a live stream on Apple Music. But all that confusion was put to rest just one day later as he announces that his Boys Don't Cry magazine will be available to purchase at select pop-up shops. This magazine included some interesting stuff. It had pictures of high-end cars, it had an interview with Lil B, and it even had a poem about McDonald's written by Kanye West. Fans were still confused because he drops an instrumental album, then he drops a magazine. Where's the actual music? Well, the announcement of that magazine also came with a music video to his song Nikes, which wasn't on the Endless album, but would later be featured on his real second album, which we now know as Blonde. So now Frank Ocean was out of his deal with Def Jam, and he gained a lot of attention due to this very unusual album rollout with Endless and then his magazine. So with all the hype, making fans wait 3 years to get a new album from him, then teasing it with this instrumental album and with this magazine, one day later, Frank Ocean finally drops Blonde. So basically what Def Jam got out of the deal was a 45-minute stream of the instrumental Endless album, because technically that counted as Frank Ocean's second album. But what the fans got was Blonde, which ended up being an Apple Music exclusively released album that Frank Ocean put out independently because he was off the Def Jam label. See, he released Endless first, completed his contract with Def Jam, then independently released the real album. This was an insane win for Frank because Blonde netted $2 million for him personally, and the Endless album only netted $157,000 for Def Jam. But that's not where the big winning came from. Blonde was a massive success, but it was also an Apple Music exclusive. Remember, at the time, Apple Music was paying artists like Drake and Chance the Rapper dozens of millions of dollars to release their albums exclusively on the Apple Music platform. Frank Ocean did the same, and according to guys like A$AP Rocky, it's rumored that that Apple Music exclusive deal was worth $20 million. Now, there's no official confirmation on this, but based off what they paid Drake and Chance the Rapper for their exclusive albums, these numbers line up. And if guys like Drake got $40 million and Chance got around 20, then it made sense that Frank also got 20. Now again, Frank Ocean paid back all the money that he borrowed from the label, so all the royalties that his music earned went directly into his pocket. And at the same time, he got $20 million roughly from Apple Music, and his Blonde album was released independently, so all the profits from that also went straight into Frank Ocean's pocket. Now it's interesting because if Frank Ocean signed his deal with Def Jam in 2009, it was probably early enough that they didn't have anything in the contract about streaming exclusives. These streaming platforms only popped off in the early 2010s. So in his 2009 contract, there was probably nothing written about what music he can or can't exclusively license to streaming platforms because they weren't big enough where that was a concern for the label. Frank was able to leverage that loophole in his contract to give Def Jam this 45-minute instrumental album, which generated no revenue just because of how plain and stripped back and vocalless it was. And immediately after that, he fully fulfilled the terms of his contract, and he was able to put out his Blonde album independently while also securing $20 million from Apple Music because he put it solely on their platform at first.
He had a deal, and he didn't put out an album in 4 years. And with his deal, he literally figured out how to get $20 million from Lucien Grange, drop his deal, figure out how to make the funds apply to a whole nother album, give him a bullshit album, get out his deal all in one round. Do you know how embarrassed the record industry was? That it took that man 2 years to do that. And then Blonde, he already got a $20 million check from Apple from that shit, which and he didn't have to give any of that back to the label because he was already out his deal once he gave them Endless.
Now this changed the industry because afterwards, record labels were extremely hesitant to ever offer artists the ability to exclusively release their music on streaming platforms in case something like this were to ever happen again. To compare it, it would be like LeBron securing a deal from the NBA, then also getting paid independently from a television network like TSN, where he can only stream his basketball games on their TV network. In the label's eyes, it wasn't fair for them because artists were able to generate profits by limiting where their music was actually distributed, which made the label less money. Now, beyond just securing that $20 million deal from Apple Music, Frank Ocean also finessed his label massively because they lost out on that $20 million, but he also paid back all of the advances and loans that he took from the label so that they own no percentage in his future music royalties. So to this day, as an independent release, Blonde is still one of the most massive R&B albums of all time and is still generating Frank tons and tons of money that the label was never able to see. This was a massive finesse because it's very hard for artists to profit off their music in general. They sign a contract with a label, the label gives them a loan that the artists have to then pay back, but the label also takes a percent of all the profits that the music makes. And streaming platforms barely pay anything to begin with. I believe it's like 1 penny for every 1,000 streams. So even if your music gets streamed millions of times, streaming companies are only paying you pennies, and then most of those pennies end up going back to the label. So not only did Frank keep all the millions of pennies from the streams that his album Blonde got, but he also earned $20 million from Apple Music to put Blonde exclusively on their platform for a short period of time. And you could only imagine that Frank Ocean is making millions and millions of dollars off that Blonde album because he's so satisfied that we haven't heard another project from him since. With $20 million plus all the millions of dollars that that album still generates him, do you think he even needs to drop another album? Do you think we'll ever see such a big finesse in the music industry ever again? Will the labels ever let something like this happen? Let me know in the comments and I'll catch you guys in the next one.